So welcome everybody. I'm Kate Colvin, the CEO of Homelessness Australia, which is the national peak body for homelessness. Can I begin by acknowledging that I'm joining from Wurundjeri country in the Kulin Nation and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. This is the first event that Homelessness Australia's had since NAIDOC Week. So can I also acknowledge the many fantastic innovators and leaders from community-controlled organisations who are working to end homelessness. So today we're going to explore what the major reforms are that affect the number of people who experience homelessness. The UK is a really fascinating case study for us because we can observe the policy reforms that made big positive changes to reduce homelessness, but also see big policy reforms that undid that good work. Hopefully we'll start soon to see in the future some policy reforms that will turn the dial back around to reduce homelessness again. So Australia can learn from this experience and hopefully pursue just the positive reforms that reduce homelessness and avoid the disastrous reforms. I don't want to give everything away before we've heard all of the presentations, but it's these kinds of learnings which underpin why Homelessness Australia so strongly advocates for adequate income support and for social housing investment, because these make a big difference to the amount of homelessness we have. And of course, we've got our government releasing a 10-year national housing and homelessness plan later this year, and we would hope that that plan includes the kind of transformational policy changes that are needed to really shift the dial on homelessness. So the purpose today is to learn what governments can do to make a difference, but I also wanted to give you a heads up about a broader research project, the Australian Homelessness Monitor, that examines the homelessness, the changes in homelessness and the causes of those changes over time. So the fourth in the series is going to be released this year, the 2024 Homelessness Monitor, and Homelessness Australia is proud to partner with Professor Hal Pawson, who's presenting today, and the Australian Homelessness Monitor research team to bring that report to you all later in the year. So I'm not going to say much more. I'll come back in later when it's time to hear questions from you. So as you're listening to the presentation, think about what you might like to ask about. So now I'm going to introduce you to Professor Hal Pawson, who's the Professor of Housing Research and Policy at the University of New South Wales and the Associate Director of the UNSW City Futures Research Centre. Hal was the co-founder of the Homelessness Monitor in the UK and leads the Australian Homelessness Monitor research team. And then also we have Dr Beth Watts-Cobbe, who's kindly joining us from very early in the morning in Edinburgh. Beth is the Senior Research Fellow and Deputy Director at the Institute for Social Policy, Housing and Equalities Research at Heriot-Watt University and leads the current iteration of the UK Homelessness Monitor. So going to present together, so I'll hand over to you both to take it from here, and I will share the screen so you can have some slides.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you this afternoon from UNSW Sydney, and I'm speaking to you from Bidjigal land. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal people in the audience, or in the room, as we say. So I'm going to just take you through the first part of this presentation, and then I will hand over to Beth. Next slide. So what we're talking about here is a project that's been running already for 14 years, and it's got another couple of years to run. So that's probably a record-breaking housing or homelessness research project. And Beth and I have been working together on that for almost all of that time. We would say this is an independent analysis of the impact of homelessness on economic and policy developments. And Suzanne Fitzpatrick, our colleague, who many of you in the room probably would know of or might have even met, was the originator of the project, and along with myself, and is still a contributor, but has handed over leadership to Beth. We've published 26 reports so far in this series, which is a gigantic amount of output. And the reason why there are so many there over such a for over a smaller number of years, is that we publish separate reports on the jurisdictions of the UK. Nowadays, just England, Scotland, and Wales, but also Northern Ireland historically. And I'm really flattered or proud to say that Homelessness Monitor England, 2 out of the last 3 editions of the Homelessness Monitor England were voted the top UK housing research report of the year in those 2 years. So we do have, I think, some kind of a standing, which I think is something that's built up over time. So what we try to do in the series is focus on 3 groups, which are somewhat overlapping, which is people sleeping rough, what in the UK is called statutory homelessness. In other words, the actions that local councils or local authorities take, which are dictated by statute or which are legally are legal duties. So these are households with some legal entitlement to housing or housing help, and thirdly, what we term the core homelessness definition, which is a kind of a modelled estimate of the most acute forms of homelessness, which includes rough sleeping, but goes a bit beyond rough sleeping as well. So next slide. And yeah, just to demonstrate the wealth of words that we've written on this topic, these are 24 out of the 26 reports that we've published: England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and 1 for Great Britain as a whole. Thank you, Kate. Next one. So what we do in this project, and this is the same methodology as we are using in the Australian Homelessness Monitor, because we basically tried to adapt the same model to the Australian context. A very important part of it is key stakeholder interviews with people from government and the NGO sector who are informed participants in the research. Some quantitative analysis on various aspects, looking at economic and social trends, looking at homelessness statistics themselves from official sources, and thirdly, statistical modelling, which is the estimation of this core homelessness concept that brings together data sets of a number of kinds and creates a kind of a robust basis for estimating this core homelessness number. And thirdly, we annually for England and every 2 or 3 years when we do these reports for the other nations of the UK, we do a local authority survey, an online survey, which also yields a huge amount of fantastic data that informs the reports. Next slide. So this is just, next couple of slides are just to give you a sense of, some people will know this in the audience, but some probably won't. The way that government relates to homelessness in the UK is much more legally defined than is in Australia. There have been local council or local authority, LA, statutory obligations towards homelessness for nearly 50 years. 1977 was the initial legislation, and that has been updated a couple of times since then. Most recently, the Homelessness Reduction Act. Could you just go back to one more back, Kate? So the original entitlements were restricted to households who are deemed eligible. In other words, their migration status or citizenship status, their status as quote unquote priority need, and I'll explain that in a minute, and that they are homeless in some legal way or legally defined way, and this homelessness came about unintentionally. There has been some divergence over the last 25 years. With the level of devolution over housing policy and homelessness policy to the nations of the UK. So Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland can to some extent go their own way in this area. So the basis for what all three countries do remains the same, but the sort of developments on that have taken Scotland and Wales in a slightly divergent direction from England. And the frontiers of that are to do with inclusivity, to do with the definition of who is entitled to these services from local councils, or who local authorities have obligations towards. The priority need test is the determining factor in England, but that is abolished in Scotland. And in relation to the level of prevention or prevention duties that local authorities must fulfil. And thirdly, who's responsible for the monitoring of who is at risk of homelessness or who has already become homeless. And this is a sort of an agenda around the mandating, really, of other public bodies to provide early warning to local authorities or notification that there's a person who's in trouble, and you as the housing authority therefore need to provide help. Next slide. So just the latest episode, or the latest phase in this legislation in England is under the Homelessness Reduction Act 2017. And that's a new sort of variation on the theme of the 1977 legislation. And what that has done is it's actually given local authorities more obligations towards homeless people. Under that legislation, there's now a duty to act in some preventative or relief, to provide prevention or relief for anyone who is homeless, not just priority need, which I'll come to in a second. Where those initial actions fail, then the local authority has more substantial duties around providing or securing settled accommodation. But that in England only relates to those who are in priority need and who became homeless unintentionally. And to get to the point of what is priority need, that means families and vulnerable people, basically. Families, household with children or containing a pregnant woman, and some single people, if they have some significant level of vulnerability to do with age, disability, ill health, etc. And when we talk about settled accommodation, there's a load of case law around all of this, defining exactly what these enforceable duties are. And settled accommodation is one of the many terms which has been defined through this case law. But what it means in broad terms is usually nomination to a suitable social housing tenancy. For a few people, it could mean nomination to a private rental property, but that is only a very, very small fraction of the cases which go through that channel. And so during the period until that duty can be discharged, that legal duty that local authorities have to these defined people in defined circumstances, what they must do until that happens is that they must provide temporary accommodation. And that has become a huge financial and logistical problem, which I'll show you the dimensions of in a moment. Next slide. So 3 slides here, and then I'll hand over to Beth. And the 3 slides are looking at different measures of what we could call the homelessness crisis, or the incidence of homelessness, the scale of homelessness. The first measure is the relatively simple one of enumerated people sleeping rough. And these numbers come from an annual survey administered by local councils and sort of collated by central government, and illustrating relatively low levels of rough sleeping during the 2000s, and the big escalation during the 2010s, interrupted by COVID, but rising on a rising trend once again subsequently. Next slide, please. And then what this one is looking at, households assessed as homeless and in priority need. This is a flow measure. The previous one is a stock measure. Numbers, a point in time measure of people who are sleeping rough was the one before, which is equivalent to our Australian census number. What this one does, though, is it's measuring the people who are coming forward or approaching local authorities and being assessed as homeless and in priority need each year over that period from 2010 to 23. And the Homelessness Reduction Act came into force in 2017, and that had a significant impact on the numbers initially, but the upward trend was then re-established, and we can see it about to, or just recently overtaking where things were before 2017, before those duties of prevention and relief were brought in. Next slide. And finally, before I hand over to Beth, the third measure of the scale of homelessness, if you like, is the number of these temporary accommodation placements at a point in time. So this is another snapshot or stock measure. And what these numbers are showing you is the blue line is the total of temporary accommodation placements at a point in time. I think we're looking at the end of each calendar year. And so we had a peak in the early 2000s of around about 100,000, then a substantial reduction. We're looking at the left-hand scale here, and then a steady and very substantial rise that went on throughout the 2010s and has now exceeded that earlier peak and is heading very much in the wrong direction, and very much the worst form of temporary accommodation, or the most unsatisfactory form, being bed and breakfast hotels. And those numbers are on the right-hand scale, and the same pattern is applied there. And very recently, kicked off by COVID, but not showing any signs of trending down after COVID. That's now gone past 15,000. So those two trends are very concerning. And extremely expensive. And there are local councils, there are bankruptcies in local councils that have been coming forward over the last 2 or 3 years, and a number of those have come about substantially because the temporary accommodation expenditure is something that they can't bear. Okay, next slide, and over to you, Beth.
Thanks very much, Hal. For those who like a spoiler, look in the chat because Paul's just summarised the rest of the presentation. What I'm going to try and explain in the rest of the presentation is why, despite the unique legal protections that Hal has just described, we've seen these very substantial increases in homelessness in England on a range of measures during the 2010s. And this slide provides an overview of 4 of the main explanatory factors that, based on the monitor, we think are key to understanding these trends. So cuts to social security, cuts to welfare provision, cuts to housing investment, and localism. And I'm going to say more about all of these, so don't worry at this point about getting your head around the detail in the right-hand column. But I think this overview is useful in making a few overarching points I'm going to make at this point. First of all, the drivers of those upwards trends in homelessness are multifactorial, and yes, they're complex. But in arguing that these 4 factors are absolutely key to understanding those trends, we're arguing that they're explicable, that they're understandable, but also that they were avoidable. And all of these factors ultimately reflect conscious and deliberate policy choices on the part of political elites, rather than the inevitable working through of inexorable social forces. And second, what underpinned all of these policy choices was the Conservative and Conservative-led government's commitments to austerity, to radically cutting expenditure, to address the economic circumstances of the country, but in a particular way that prioritised spending cuts targeted on those with the lowest incomes over other forms of spending cuts or overall or tax rises. And this agenda was obviously undergirded by an analysis of the required remedy to the aftermath of the global financial crisis, which was allied to an ideology among the right that saw, a shrinking of the state as a good thing, basically, and in particular of the welfare state. So I'm going to start by focusing on changes to social security that the post-2010 coalition government made. They swiftly acted to cap and cut welfare benefits in various ways, some of them listed on the right-hand side here, and by ramping up the extent to which benefits were conditional on various types of behaviour. In addition, they made a range of what I guess you might call more technical and less noticeable, less headline grabby changes, including freezing benefits, so they didn't keep pace with inflation, and also within the details of introducing a new overall benefit, social security benefit called universal credit, some kind of technical changes that actually were really consequential. So for example, that required people to wait 5 weeks for the very first payment of social security. And a major focus of the local authority survey that is a really key part of the homelessness monitors has been asking local authorities what they expect the impacts of these kind of changes to be over the coming year and what they report the impacts being over the past year. So Kate, if we could see the next slide. So local authorities who, as Hal described, have the legal duties to assist homeless households have consistently been clear in their expectation that these changes would increase homelessness. These are the results from a question we asked in 2017 regarding the expected impacts on homelessness of 5 key social security reforms. A side note, the removal of housing benefit for 18 to 21-year-olds, the complete removal of housing benefit was on the table as an expected policy reform. And as you can see, there was just enormous concern about the massive upswing in youth homelessness that would be the result of that. And it actually wasn't introduced as a result of the opposition to it, a very rare victory, I guess, in the context of the wider swathe of social security cuts. And as I say, the freezes to working age benefits, whilst not as attention grabbing as things like the bedroom tax, which lowered the housing allowance owed to those in social housing that was a bit bigger than they needed. Things like the bedroom tax were very controversial, but freezes to benefits were less so and grabbed less attention, but by local authorities were really feared for their impacts on homelessness, as the real value of those benefits was whittled away over years and years. And changes to local housing allowance, and I'll explain what that is in a second, have consistently, as you can see here, been an area of acute concern for local authorities. So I'm going to focus on local housing allowance. Thanks, Kate. Now, so local housing allowance is the formula determining the housing benefit or housing allowance payments owed to eligible renters. And it's based on the household size and also the level of local market rents. And originally, when introduced, the rate of payment was equivalent to the median local market rent. And Hal has provided a very useful analysis here on the slide of how it differs from your rent assistance system. So payments relate to local market conditions. As I've said, it's not a one-size-fits-all national limit. It's significantly more generous than rent assistance relative to actual rents. And it's also crucially available to low-income workers ineligible for other social security payments. So I'm making the case that there were some really damaging changes here, but understand that the context is very different in Australia. So if we move on to the next slide. Thank you. So various changes were made to how local housing allowance works post-2010. So first of all, restrictions facing young people under 26, meaning that they could only claim the rate for a room in a shared house rather than a self-contained dwelling, were extended to those under 35. The amount of payment was capped at the 30th percentile of local rents rather than the median. And local housing allowance, along with other working age benefits, was frozen for 2 4-year periods, ultimately meaning that its value eroded to well below the 30th percentile of local rents. And indeed, a range of studies have found that in some areas, only a handful, and in some cases, no properties were available at all to rent at the local housing allowance rate relevant to that particular area, given rent inflation. Hence, local authority testimony that you can see here that in some areas it was basically impossible or at least extremely difficult to find places to rent. And as a result, we've seen increasing proportions of households face a gap between the rent they must pay and the assistance they receive, a gap that must be met through their other income from benefits or work, income that is by definition for this group low. And also, of course, alongside that, impacts on landlords' willingness to rent to those in receipt of benefits. So local housing allowance in 2020, as a result of the COVID pandemic and efforts to mitigate the impacts of that on homelessness, was rebased again to the 30th percentile of local rents before another 4-year freeze ensued. And we asked local authorities how important that had been in preventing or minimizing homelessness in their area. They overwhelmingly, 82%, said that it had been important, 46% significantly so. And then we asked in 2021 what the impact of the refreezing would be on homelessness, and over 3/4 said it would increase homelessness, 39% significantly so. And another part of the monitors that we're not talking about terribly much today, but my colleague Glenn Bramley leads work modelling, projecting various policy scenarios and their impact on homelessness into the future, and properly basing LHA on median rents and effectively uprating it with inflation is consistently emerges as one of the most effective ways of preventing escalations in homelessness in the future. Next slide. So alongside these really quite radical cuts to social security benefits, of which local housing allowance was just one, but for homelessness an incredibly important one, we saw wider austerity-driven cuts to welfare and support services. And incredibly important here were changes made to what's called the Supporting People Fund, which was established 20 years ago to help vulnerable people live independently. In practice, it funded floating housing support, helping many people who would be at risk of homelessness without it to stay in their homes. And the budget was initially ring-fenced, so local authorities had to spend it on those kind of services. But the ring fence was removed in 2009, so just before the governments we're mainly talking about here came into power, meaning that although supporting people remained a named budget line, local authorities could actually choose what to spend that money on. That supporting people budget was subject to absolutely swinging cuts as part of the Conservative and Conservative-led government's wider austerity agenda, amounting to 78% in real terms over the 8 years to 2019. And you can see this voluntary sector key informant we spoke to in 2018 making the point that this cut was deeply consequential for homelessness and not in any way compensated for by the relatively small-scale investment in tackling rough sleeping that we started to see in 2017, 2018. Reflecting that street homelessness, as Hal showed you, had just rocketed. In essence, these policy choices amounted to a reinvestment away from prevention and tenancy sustainment into a sticking plaster response focused on people who had reached the very most acute form of housing crisis. Okay, next slide. So perhaps having painted the picture thus far, you won't be surprised to hear that housing investment was also dramatically impacted by this emphasis on cutting public spending. Capital investment in affordable housing saw a 65% cut in just 2 years at the start of the Conservative government period. It's also important that much of that radically reduced spending was redirected from social housing to so-called affordable housing, where rent levels are below market rents, but still much higher than in traditional social housing, and even more regressively towards supporting home ownership, either for first-time buyers or those buying via shared ownership schemes. And the result of that is a steady but also quite significant reduction in the flow of lets available to homeless people as well as other households. Next slide. And finally, the impact of these social security reforms and austerity-driven cuts to housing support and housing investment were all exacerbated by the impacts of localism. Localism being the delegation of financial flexibilities and policy autonomies to local areas. So localism is something that has received support from across the political spectrum, and indeed initial moves in a localist direction were taken in the late 2000s under the then Labour administration. I've already mentioned the removal of the ring fence on supporting people, so that was about giving power and decision-making power to local authorities. But post-2010, the Conservative-led government pursued this agenda with enthusiasm, delegating spending decisions on crisis assistance and council tax relief, rates relief to local authorities, increasing the importance of locally run schemes like discretionary housing payments, and radically increasing local authority discretion over social housing eligibility and tenure security within social housing. And these changes have been highly problematic from a homelessness perspective, essentially enabling local authorities to deprioritise households facing or at risk of homelessness if they so desire. And for those interested in the nuts and bolts of that argument, you can see a paper published a few years ago by Suzanne Fitzpatrick, Hal and I in Policy and Politics that argues that localism is intrinsically and necessarily risky from the perspective of protecting vulnerable groups, including people experiencing homelessness. and that homelessness reduction, homelessness prevention really needs national government central protections. And one of the dynamics here captured in this quote is captured in this quote, where this key informant explains that because of this localism agenda, the central government department responsible for homelessness really absented itself from supporting or directing local authorities in relation to homelessness at all, at the same time as introducing a range of wider changes that were driving homelessness up. In other words, austerity-related cuts and localism became a pretty toxic mix. And because this combination of austerity and localism was so damaging to homelessness, it was ultimately abandoned, specifically in relation to homelessness, in 2017-18, when Theresa May's Conservative government took the reins again, developing a rough sleeping strategy and associated funding to try and reverse the rapid escalation seen in the preceding years. But as you've seen quoted on previous slides, this was, while not completely ineffective, a relative drop in the ocean. It's also worth noting that the homelessness response to the COVID pandemic was decidedly centrist, decidedly not localist, with national government taking a very firm and clear view and leadership role in instructing and supporting local authorities to get everyone in off the streets and into single room provision. And I know some similar things happened in Australia. So I think I've got time to just quickly try and strengthen our argument yet further by making a comparison between England and Scotland. So I'm going to show you a few quick graphs now. And the main point of them is to say that legal safety net that Hal explained to you is one of the key differences between Scotland and England. And that, in combination with a few other different policy choices, means that the trends that you saw in England actually look quite different in Scotland. So if we go to the next slide, this is just a reminder of the trends in rough sleeping. Sorry, one back, Kate, my apologies. This is the slide you saw earlier. We can see initially a drop that was under Labour pre-2010. And then for all the reasons we've explained, that absolutely almost unbelievable escalation in rough sleeping. And then 2017-18, you see the impact of that Theresa May retreat from localism. Eventually, they decided they would start to invest and look at this again. And then you see the very dramatic impact of COVID, and then the resurgence of upward trends because all of those causal drivers were still in play, basically. If you go on to the next slide, it's a different measure of rough sleeping, but the comparison between trends, if not numbers, is, I think, very meaningful. And what you see here is a big reduction in rough sleeping over the 2010s. Now, that social security context that I described to you is more or less, it's not exactly similar. I'll say something briefly about that in a second, but it's more or less the same. So why do we see this completely different trend in rough sleeping? Well, we see it because in Scotland, that priority need test that means local authorities only have to rehouse essentially families with children was taken away. So single homeless households in Scotland erode that legal duty, and that was phased in up to 2012. And this graph basically shows the impacts of taking that legally inclusive approach. So that just underlines the point that these are policy choices. If we go on to the next slide, this is just a reminder of what Hal showed you earlier about those changes in reliance on temporary accommodation in England and that very rapid, again, escalation through the 2010s. And if we look in Scotland, we see something a bit different. Through the 2010s, we see levels of temporary accommodation use in Scotland at historic highs. Next slide, Kate. Now it'll jump to, won't it? We see, stability at an historic high. Now, what explains that, I think, are two main things. First of all, the fact that in Scotland, there was some effort to mitigate the impact of those social security cuts. Scotland didn't have its hand on all the levers it needed, but it did in some quite important ways mitigate the impacts of those cuts and was able to do that. Also, absolutely crucially, that housing context I talked about is very different in Scotland. Scotland went into this period with a higher social housing stock. It maintained investment in social housing, much more than was the case in England. And historically and to this day, Scotland allocates a much higher percentage of its higher social housing stock to homeless households. And for all of those reasons, that's why we see this trend here. And it was finally COVID that pushed pushed Scotland into seeing this escalation in temporary accommodation use, which as it stands, it hasn't been able to get back down again. And many local authorities in Scotland are talking about a housing crisis because of that. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. I'll just offer some final concluding reflections. So it's a story of two halves, really. In the UK, in England and Scotland, we have this internationally unique legal rights-based approach that offers very strong protections to many of those facing homelessness. And not only has it survived a period of massive welfare state retrenchment and austerity, but actually, and this is another story, it was modernized during that period to be more inclusive and more preventative. Moving on to the next slide. Thank you. But welfare reforms and austerity, among a few other contextual factors, have really undermined the power of that legal safety net to prevent increases in homelessness. So those reforms have driven increases, they've increased the inflow, they've made it harder for local authorities to resolve homelessness, reduce the outflow, and they've left those legal entitlements harder to implement, especially where housing market pressures are highest. And as a result, we've seen rising homelessness and rising reliance on expensive and often poor quality temporary accommodation. And the absolutely fundamental, boiled down to its essence, policy choice that explains all that is the UK decision to fix the deficit via spending cuts, and spending cuts targeted at low-income households. So this homelessness crisis, we think, was avoidable. And I think there are very clear lessons, not only for our incoming Labour government, but I would hope, and maybe we can talk about this in Australia too. And it comes down to the very simple fact that effective homelessness policy requires coherence across government and clear cross-government action and leadership. The next slide just shows you where you can read 26 120-page reports at your leisure. So, and it's very nice to be with you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Beth, and thanks so much, Hal. That's really fantastic. So just to highlight some of those differences, because I think it's hard sometimes to see the impact of things that we don't have getting reduced. So just to sort of make that comparison. So in Australia, we have rent assistance, which doesn't extend to low-income households who are working, and unless they've got family tax benefits, and we have rent assistance payments that are much lower than the rent than the housing benefit paid in the UK, and yet you can see what the impact of having an adequate rental payment and then reducing it is. So I guess the context for Australia is that we need to get to that point of adequacy and what a difference that would make. And I also just particularly note that change in investment in social housing, because of course when new social housing is being built, that brings on board new tenancy opportunities that you know, when you've got the existing stock of social housing, obviously some of those properties turn over every year, but a new social housing unit developed is always available for a new tenant. And so when that new social housing investment drops off like it did, it makes a sort of more outsized impact on the number of new tenancies coming forward for people who are homeless, particularly, as you were saying, Beth, those new investments in social housing were directed towards affordable housing and not social housing. So and then just lastly, the one thing I want to note, because it's another thing that we don't have that I think is really important in the UK, is that supporting, what was it called, the supporting people payment, which provides floating support to people who are vulnerable households who need support with their housing to retain that housing. And of course, that's something that's a huge gap in the homelessness capacity to respond, or overall welfare system capacity to respond in Australia. And consequently, we have actually quite high unplanned exits from social housing and other forms of housing from vulnerable tenants. So that adds to the burden on homelessness, because people are re-entering homelessness not getting the support that they need. So there's some amazing lessons there. But I wonder if anyone has any.
Did the video stop? Or was it just
Yeah,
me? Okay.
no, it hasn't. It's a pretty epic freeze from Kay. I'm sure she'll come back in soon, but someone can jump in with a question in the meantime if they want while she recovers.
I've just popped my question in the chat.
Oh, great. I think that's one for you, Hal.
Homelessness prevention. You want me to pick that one up?
I think it's
What
about in
type-
Australia. So
What type of assistance is available for people working but cannot afford rents in Australia? Well, yeah, it's limited. There are small schemes, but there isn't. It works in a completely different way because local councils are not part of the story hardly at all, and they don't have these. There's no. It wouldn't be feasible to give these duties to local councils in the Australian context in the way that it is in the UK. So, yeah, I mean, I think the answer is the specialist homelessness services, do what they can, but the level of demand for those services is huge, and an awful lot of people don't even get through the door.
Now, sorry, I dropped off there.
yeah, welcome back.
You're probably in a better position to answer that question than me, Kate, actually.
I missed the question because my connection dropped out.
So the question is, in relation to homelessness prevention, what type of assistance is available for people working but cannot afford rents?
Yeah, that's very dependent on the capacity or policies at the particular homelessness service or in the particular state. So there's nothing that's kind of regulated in the way that there is in the UK. And one of the things that happens is that the more people are coming through the door in crisis, the less capacity services at the front door have to respond to someone who's clutching an eviction notice when they've got 5 people who don't have anywhere to sleep that night. So one of the things that is part of the conversation at the moment is getting some separate funding for prevention so that you can have ring-fenced prevention programs, because it's very obviously it's when you're thinking about the overall flow of people into homelessness, if you can prevent people at the point at which they're going to become homeless, then that's a lot less obviously a lot better for them, and it's also a lot less work at a homelessness service response level, rather than trying to rehouse them in a really difficult housing market if you've missed that opportunity to prevent the homelessness. So it sort of makes a lot of sense from a system perspective. But I wonder, Wendy, did you want to ask a question?
I did. So thanks, Beth and Hal. And my question, I thought I'd concentrate on the positive. There was one graph where you showed the impact of what had happened when the Homelessness Prevention Act had come in and the numbers went down. So obviously that had a massive impact. Can you talk a bit more about what local authorities all of a sudden started doing that they hadn't been doing before, and what lessons there might be for us?
Well, I could start just to say that it means that it requires them to be more proactive, especially towards people who are very unlikely to be in priority need. In other words, single people. Would that be right, Beth?
Yeah, that's absolutely the most important thing. It made the change in England that local authorities suddenly had substantive responsibilities to help single people experiencing homelessness, and that was a really radical change. It was a really key act increasing the inclusivity of responses to homelessness. I mean, what that actually meant in practice was, like, payments to help with rent arrears or to help people meet their budget. Sometimes the provision of things like mediation. Sometimes prevention or relief actually just meant finding alternative accommodation to people, or just doing something that meant that talking to the landlord and helping people remain in their current accommodation that was at risk. So it looked like a various number of actual practical things. But the big change was that local authorities suddenly had to do that. And in the past, it had really been at the discretion of local areas whether they did any of that. And in that period of austerity, obviously, it was quite hard to go above and beyond legal duties. So,
and I think also, as far as the cohort who potentially are in priority need, they were also part of this new, more proactive duty to either prevent or relieve homelessness. But what that relief duty would involve would be something possibly less than the settled accommodation, which is the previous, which is still the floor below, which you can't allow a person in priority need to go below. But an initial attempt would be made to help someone in a way that might be less certain of being a solution. And if that falls through, then the statutory duty to secure settled accommodation kicks in, and so that duty is still there as a backstop. And in the initial years of the HRA regime after 2017, a lot of the people in priority need were sort of diverted from, or assisted ahead of their filtering through to that ultimate legal duty to provide to secure settled accommodation. But that has become increasingly difficult over that period, quite rapidly more difficult, mostly because the ability to help someone out by getting them into a private tenancy has disappeared because of this question of the value of local housing allowance being massively eaten away by inflation when it's frozen in cash terms.
Trish?
Thank you. That was great hearing that presentation. Hal, I did work at Crisis UK helping 5 local authorities to implement the Homelessness Reduction Act. So I did have a bit of a fairly good understanding of what it entailed and how it changed things. And I have to say, it really, to me, depended on how good the local authority was, because the prevention and the relief was developing 2 housing plans and 56 days for each. Prevention, as you know, sorry, I'm just saying this for other people. And so the local authority could develop that plan, and almost like their legal duties were completed once they developed that plan and followed up. But, there were certain councils that could do that quite well, and others would just hand it to someone and that's all they needed to do. So coming from an Australian context, I took a long time, and I was never convinced that the Homelessness Reduction Act actually changed things. And I don't think it would be something that you would have to bring to Australia, because I just don't think we would change things. Because if someone wasn't considered priority, they come in, it could be someone who was sleeping rough, they're not priority, and you're saying to them, oh, look, I'll develop this housing plan for you, here you go. I mean, that was quite offensive to people coming in who's going to sleep rough that night. So I did have, but when you saw a local authority do it well and implement the Homelessness Reduction Act as effectively as they possibly could, it was great. But my question is, do we need legislation to do it well?
I mean,
that was you, Beth. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, God, there was so much there, Trish. I mean, the big gap in the Homelessness Reduction Act is exactly as you pointed to. For those single people experiencing homelessness, including people rough sleeping, there were duties for prevention and relief. If those duties were not successful in relieving the homelessness, ultimately that person still wasn't in priority need and ultimately still didn't get rehoused. That's a massive, massive gap, and Scotland and Wales are doing their best to move past that. It's still the case that the Homelessness Reduction Act was a net positive in improving responses to homelessness in, across the country. Absolutely right that there were still gaps in it and enormous local variation. And this does link to a question in the chat about what happens if local authorities don't meet those duties. And there are two things. There's individual legal recourse. Obviously, there are high barriers to any individual pursuing that, but those remedies do exist. But partly because of that, we have a very dynamic civil society who will take on those cases and object and call the local authority and say, we will challenge you in court. And very often then the local authority will just do what they're meant to. So that's a very, very quick answer to that question. In terms of whether you need the law or not, I mean, I think the law is I think the law helps equalize entitlements and introduce those legal enforcement mechanisms. So I think it's incredibly important, necessary but not sufficient, I would say. But it's also very, very clearly the case that you can achieve a great deal without those legal entitlements. So I don't think the implications of this presentation in Australia are like, well, we're quite far away from having those individually enforceable legal entitlements, so hands up in the air, what can we do? I mean, I think what can be distilled from this presentation, and Kate, you did that in the intro to an extent, are all the things you can do absent that individually enforceable legal rights framework to address these things. And that's some of the things we've been talking about ring fence funding for housing support, ring fence funding for prevention, but it's also about an adequate social security safety net. I don't mean to imply these things are early, but obviously we can achieve a great deal without legally enforceable rights, even though, they're great. You guys should have them.
Thanks, Beth.
I disagree. I don't think we do need them. But anyway, that's just me.
Well, I think I understand from Hal that it's almost a moot point because of the structure of local government, it would be a very, very, very long road, even if you decided you did want them, because of the nature between, national government, state governments and local authorities. So my suggestion to you isn't that you go away and have these legal rights, because I think that's a very, very long road, even if you decided you did. So I agree with you, Trish, like crack on and take other routes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Kate. Look, I'm not sure who might be best to respond to this, but one of the indirect benefits I understand of the legislative regime in the UK was an investment in the community housing sector, for example, innovation, transfer of stock and so forth. So I believe that, and I'd like to confirm this by those of you who are aware, that it goes beyond the direct benefits for the individuals that might be experiencing homelessness, but actually help build a system which is, I think, stronger than ours, relatively speaking. Would that be true?
Shall I take that? I mean, absolutely, yes. I mean, there's a process which really began in, well, council housing was something which started to be accumulated right from 1919, and then there was a slight change of emphasis in the 1970s, where it was the main target of government support for development of social housing transferred to not-for-profits, or the equivalent of community housing as it is in Australia, housing associations, and that has continued. That hasn't completely disappeared. But as one of Beth's slides showed, has been really eroded away very substantially in the 2010s. So yes, that the investment that is still continuing at a pretty low level, but still continuing. At least what we can say there is a continuous program. Even now, there has been a continuous program in a way which is completely foreign in Australia since 1996. There's been one very significant departure from that for 2 years in 2010-11, and then back to virtually nothing, no sort of national program. So yeah, that's an enormous difference, and that the result of that is that the social housing component of the housing system in the UK is, well, in England is around 17%, so 4 times what it is in Australia. And that is what provides the capacity to absorb these people with statutory rights.
Thanks, Hal. Nicola, did you want to ask a question? I think that'll be the last question.
Hi, I wanted to ask about supporting people. So as somebody that's worked as a support worker utilising supporting people funds for a community housing provider in the UK, I recognise how important that was to the ability to sustain tenancies and therefore prevent that revolving door of homelessness you were talking about earlier, Kate. One of the things that's been difficult here in Australia is really you find as a community housing provider you're having to cross-subsidise those tenancy sustainment services because there isn't enough fat in the system to absorb that, and there's nowhere to make referrals to as a community housing provider. Even if you're working with lots of really good partners, it's very difficult for them as well. At times in my old organisation at Hume Community Housing, we were able to access NDIS funding and maximise people's packages, which helped to some extent. But yes, in other ways, we were constantly trying to cross-subsidise additional support for people in need. And we also used to, in the UK, report turnover and exit data quite transparently, which doesn't happen as well here in Australia. And I wondered, I'm not clear where supporting people is up to now and what kind of policies are in place that might enable or be something that Australia can learn from in terms of accessing supporting people funds into the future. I know there's bits of it like Together Home in New South Wales and other initiatives, but I wondered what's the status of supporting people now in the UK?
Could you deal with that one, Kate? Beth, I'm afraid I can't, but hopefully you can.
Yeah. So it's quite different, and the main story is how different it is in Scotland and England versus in Wales. So in Scotland and England, that ring fenced is removed. There's still a line in the budget that goes to local authorities who can spend it wherever they want. The big difference is in Wales, where the ring fence was never removed. So there's still a big pot of money that goes to local authorities. I forget the name of it, but that is explicitly for this, and that means that is a really significant protection in Wales. And in Wales, it's also highlighted the workforce challenge around this. So this is a low paid sector, hard to recruit, hard to sustain. And in Wales, that issue is quite high up the agenda, I would say. Whereas in Scotland and England, it is less so. I mean, one of the things that's happened in parallel with those changes is, and as you guys will all be experiencing as well, the sort of upsurge in attention on housing first. So that's that's a different kind of housing support for a particular, well, not a different kind of support, but it's targeted at a different group and coming from different funding streams. So I think in England, there's chronic underinvestment in that kind of support at the moment. It's happening more in some isolated ways that haven't been mainstreamed as part of Housing First. But that's like a really key. I mean, we're in a bad state with it, basically. I'm not sure that there are any lessons, and hopefully it's one of the long list of things that this new government will take seriously. Because I think the other thing I just really want to quickly mention, it's 1 minute past 8, is another really important thing that's happened in the UK is social landlords have become, obviously there's huge variation in practice, but increasingly reluctant to evict people into homelessness. And my ears really pricked up when you mentioned that wasn't so much the case in Australia. I think that's been a really big and important protective change for those who are in social housing. It's increasingly actually stigmatized for social housing providers to evict into homelessness. Of course, it still happens, but some providers just don't do it at all. In some big cities, there's a handful of people getting evicted from social housing a year. So that's another really important allied change. And of course, some of that support is provided by social landlords themselves, off their own back. So that's an important part of this picture too, I think.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Beth, particularly for getting up so early and speaking to us and sharing all that. And thanks to Hal for your presentation as well. Thanks to everyone for coming along. And I'll just flag that the ideas that we've talked about in this event will be picked up in a different way in an event on the 22nd, which is being hosted by Homelessness Australia, but together with Peak body colleagues, Wendy from Community Housing Industry Association and Emma from National Shelter, looking at the National Housing and Homelessness Plan Private Members Bill. And we'll hear from Dr. Chris Martin about how legislating for an effective national plan could make a difference in Australia. So the link's there if you want to register for that event. If you want to hear updates from Homelessness Australia, I've put a link to the website and you can join our e-bulletin at the bottom of the website page. But other than that, thank you so much for joining. This event's been recorded, so we'll distribute the link after the event. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kate. That was great. Thank you.